حدود 6 ماه پیش اینجا در اورشلیم با بنیامین نتانیاهو نخست وزیر اسرائیل گفتگو کردم تا از او درباره سیاست‌های کشورش در قبال جمهوری اسلامی بپرسم و همینطور حمایت این کشور از انقلابی که در ایران در جریان هست. مهمان این هفته من از همین شهر وزیر امور استراتژیک کابینه بنیامین نتانیاهو است، از نزدیکترین مشاوران به نخست وزیر اسرائیل، بیش از 2 دهه است که با هم همکاری می‌کنن و 8 سال سفیر این کشور بوده در ایالات متحده. گفتگوی من رو خواهید دید در دقایق آینده با ران درمر، وزیر امور استراتژیک بنیامین نتانیاهو. Ambassador Dremer, nice talking to you for the first time, and thanks for accepting my interview request. They call you the chief strategist of Bibi Netanyahu's government. What is your job exactly?
I'm the Minister of Strategic Affairs. I like to joke that I wanted to be the Minister of Tactical Affairs because everybody's a strategist and no one's a tactician. But with all seriousness, the issues that the Prime Minister asked me to work with him when I joined the government, and I'm not an elected member of our parliament. I'm actually the only minister that wasn't elected a member of the parliament. But he asked me to come back into government after 7.5 years being Israel's ambassador to Washington to really deal with 3 issues. One of them is to work to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons and to deal with the threats posed by that very, very dangerous regime. The second thing was to see if we could effect a historic breakthrough, another historic breakthrough. We had the Abraham Accords, peace with Saudi Arabia. And the third is our relations with the United States. And of course, all of those are interconnected. So that's the portfolio that I work on. And I've been proud to work by the Prime Minister's side for over 2 decades. So I've been with him for 23 years, actually.
Yeah, you're close friends and probably you are one of his closest advisors. So what you said is the core of my questions, Ambassador, today. Let's start with UNGA. Prime Minister was in New York a few days ago. He met with Joe Biden and they just talked about Iran. You were the ambassador to the US for 8 years. What is Israel-US relations, specifically on Iran issue today?
Well, I think, first of all, the U.S.-Israel relationship is very strong, and it gets stronger all the time because our interests are pulling the 2 countries together, both the economic interests and the security interests. On the question of Iran, we've had periods where we've agreed more and we've agreed less with the U.S. administration. With Obama, there were clearly gaps between what we thought and what they did. The Obama administration did the nuclear deal with the Iranian regime, which we thought it was a historic mistake. And as you know, the Prime Minister went to Congress, was invited to the Congress and spoke out against the nuclear deal with Iran and the danger that that would pose to our country, which we think would be a threat to the very survival of the state. During the Trump years, our policy was much more aligned, this maximum pressure campaign, which I think was very effective when it had all the elements together. And with the Biden administration, we have tried over the last few months to try to align our policies more and more with the Biden administration. And I think we've made some progress to that. We're not fully aligned, but we got close. We're getting closer. And I think the Prime Minister's meeting with President Biden, I think, helped to move us even closer.
Let me give you some examples of issues probably you agree less, as you mentioned yourself. U.S. released $6 billion ransom money to exchange some hostages with the Iranian regime. Do you think it was appropriate policy?
Well, listen, these types of things with prisoners are very difficult. Israel's had some of our own issues with them. We think any money that goes to the regime is not going to go to the Iranian people. It's not going to help them build schools and build hospitals and improve their lives. It's going to go to fuel their war machine in the region, their war machine with the Houthis in Yemen or with Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Shia militias in Iraq. And so we think any type of deals with this regime are usually not a good thing. But, you know, that's the United States made that decision. What I can say in terms of... They
say actually they said to the Iranians that they need to spend this money on humanitarian issues. How can we test that? How can we actually... where the checks and balances are?
Well, there's no checks and no balances. But you heard what the Iranians said, what the Iranian leadership said. What is the definition for them of humanitarian issues? It's whatever they think is humanitarian. So whatever they define, they're saying that openly. I think the United States believes that they're going to have some mechanism, and I hope they will, to make sure that that money only goes to humanitarian, medicine, food, and things like that. The problem, of course, with money is that it's fungible. If you use money for one thing, you can free up money to use for something else.
Exactly.
And we know from past experience that when Iran gets an influx of cash, the Iranian regime, it does not use it to improve the lives of their own people. I mean, look where Iran is today in terms of its GDP per capita. I think they have about 10 times the population than we do, and we have almost the same GDP per capita. And the Iranian people are highly intelligent, very sophisticated. There's no reason why they shouldn't have a GDP that would be high in terms of even European standards. They were a very wealthy country 40 years ago, 45 years ago, before this regime took power. I have no question in my mind that when the regime goes into the dustbin of history, which I believe is inevitable, I think that you're going to see the Iranian people, when they're in charge of their own future, I think that you're going to see Iran grow very dramatically over a period of time. And they will not only join the community of nations, they will be one of the leaders in the region and beyond.
I am sure. There was an article in, get back to the US again, there was an article in New York Times about a couple of months ago, revealed by Israeli sources, by the way, saying this exchange of hostages between Iran and US is part of a more comprehensive deal going on between two countries. Do you confirm this news? And if so, what can we know about this more comprehensive deal between Iran and US?
Well, first, let me say one thing I would say about US-Israel. Even though we don't agree on every little issue or this or that understanding or deal or something like that, I must say that this administration, the Biden administration, has been transparent with Israel. That wasn't always the case during the Obama years. Now we understand what their policy is and what they're trying to do. And even if we're not fully in agreement, as I said, I think we're closer to where we were a few months ago. But in terms of this last deal, whether or not that is a hallway to a bigger deal, that remains to be seen. I think there was a feeling that if you make some understanding and some agreement with Iran, that would pave the way for you to do a much broader deal. Our policy is certainly to oppose any return.
So you confirm the news that U.S. is seeking a more comprehensive deal?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask the Americans for that. I won't confirm that that's what they want to do. I think they're very cautious about going back to the same nuclear deal that was on the table. I think there were efforts to try to reach that deal last August. But I think afterwards, once the people of Iran rose up, I think that affected international opinion, and it also affected, I'd say, the political space for people to do deals with such a regime that would so brutalize its own people. And I think also Iran's decision to supply these drones to Russia to be used in Ukraine, I think that's also affected public opinion. But the biggest problem with the nuclear deal, just understand, is the nuclear deal has all sorts of sunset clauses in it, that over a certain number of years, the restrictions that the deal puts on Iran's nuclear program would be automatically removed. And in those two words, automatically removed, that's why Israel was opposed to that deal in 2015. Now we're 8 years later. In 2 or 3 weeks from now, the missiles, the restrictions that were put on Iran's missile program, they're due to sunset. In another 2 years, the centrifuge restrictions are due to sunset. And a few years after that, all the stockpile restrictions on Iran's enriched uranium will sunset. So there's really no point in going back to the nuclear deal. Under the nuclear deal, just understand.
So what about the new deal they're talking about?
Well, it has to be.
Which actually, I've read in some articles, Israel is less upset comparing with JCPOA if this deal goes through.
Well, you'd have to see what the details are. Those things are always the devil's in the details. I will tell you that Israel's main opposition to the nuclear deal in 2015 were these sunset clauses, okay? Is a new deal going to deal with different sunset clauses, or are they going to say, you know what, if you go back into the nuclear deal that was on the table then, in 12 or 13 years, which means from 2015, it means in 2027 or 2028, the breakout time for Iran to get the fissile material necessary for a nuclear device, that breakout time was 0. That's not what I said. That's what Obama said at the time. That was 2015, and the prime minister then spoke in Congress. And he said, you know, a decade may seem like a long time in the life of politics, and it is. But it's a blink of an eye in the life of a nation. We're already 8 years into what was supposed to be a 10 to 15-year deal. So a big mistake to go back to that nuclear deal. Now, if there would be a new deal, I think that deal has to remove the infrastructure from Iran. I'd have to do one of two things. Either you have to totally remove the nuclear infrastructure from Iran, because this is obviously a regime that can't be trusted, that has violated its commitments time and again. You have to either remove the nuclear infrastructure, or if you're going to leave nuclear infrastructure, you have to make sure there are no sunset clauses, that these restrictions are permanent restrictions, that they're not something that you can just wait 5 years or 10 years and they'll automatically be removed. That's a mistake. Now, I don't believe that today Iran is willing to do such a deal, because I don't think, frankly, that they face the type of pressure they need to be facing from the international community.
Especially export of oil and whatever they were doing before.
Exactly. Iran just recently it went over 2 million barrels a day exporting. Now, when Iran faced real pressure, and go back and understand what happened with the maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration was putting on Iran. Trump did not leave the nuclear deal for a year and a half into his administration. It was only in May 2018. Then he took another year before he got rid of these waivers, which allowed Iran to sell oil. So real economic pressure on Iran just began May 2019. Within 8 months of that pressure, Iran was only selling 300,000 barrels, exporting 300,000 barrels a day. They cannot sustain 300,000 barrels a day. Now they're up to over 2 million barrels a day. So the Iranians feel we're not facing real economic pressure. I don't know if they believe right now, I hope they do, that they would face a credible military threat if they would try to break out to the bomb. But I think it's the combination of a credible military threat to prevent a breakout, real crippling economic sanctions, particularly on the oil, and the third critical element, and here is a criticism of previous administrations, American administrations, not just the Biden administration, not just the Trump administration, also the Obama administration, all U.S. administrations. I have not seen a clear leg in a policy to support the people of Iran, to give a tailwind to them, to tell the people of Iran, to use the pulpit of the presidency of the United States to speak out very forcefully on behalf of the people of Iran. You didn't hear the voice of the American president in 2009 when Iranians came into the streets after the election was stolen from them. And you really didn't hear...
They even called him. They said, Obama, either you need to be with them or with us.
Because he was focused on getting a deal. And I think it's interesting that after these recent protests, or last year, when you had all these courageous people in Iran who went to the streets, hundreds of them were murdered. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, are arrested. What did you hear from the international community? What did you hear from the leaders of the world? If you probably took all the quotes, I don't know if they're going to fill up a page. When really that should be something that day after day, the leaders of the world, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the President of France, the Chancellor of Germany, day after day has to send a message to the people of Iran that we are with you. And I think that above all, you tell me, but that above all is what I think the Iranian people want, is they want to know that the world stands with them. And they don't hear that message in a consistent way. And when they were out there braving bullets, they heard it a little bit. But after the protests stopped, within a week, a month, it's back to business. And I think that's a big mistake. This is not a regime that anyone should do business with.
$6 billion actually give
very disheartening. It's very disheartening. And I understand that it's very disheartening because they're doing deals. You know, the United States is trying to get its people out. I understand that. But from the point of view of the Iranian people, why are you doing deals with this regime that is brutalizing us, repressing us, and threatens the entire region? And I think the more that international voice is loud and clear, the more it will give a tailwind to the people of Iran. Because our real hope for the region, in my view, our real hope is that the people of Iran seize their future. That you're not dealing with this very dangerous Iranian regime that took a great society, a great civilization, and has driven it into the ground and has made it a threat to all its neighbors, rather than the people of Iran, you know, seizing their own future and becoming, I think, a proud and vibrant democracy that will be a leader, as I said, in the Middle East and beyond. And there's no reason, you know, Israel had good relations with Iran before 1979. So did the United States.
Yeah.
I have no doubt that post this regime in Iran, that Israel will be a friend of the Iranian people. And I think that America will be a great friend of the Iranian people. And from what I've seen in polls, probably after the people of Israel, Iran are probably the two most pro-American peoples in the region.
Right. You mentioned a credible military plan and action a few times in this interview. What is exactly a clear military plan and action? What are the elements of this plan?
Well, listen, a clear and credible threat, I think, is essential in order to prevent a rogue regime from developing nuclear weapons. I mean, this is something that the Prime Minister has talked about on many occasions, where you've had 5 different cases of rogue regimes who seek to develop nuclear weapons. 2 of them, in the case of Saddam's Iraq in 1981 and Assad's Syria in 2007, it wasn't a credible military threat that stopped them, it was credible military action by Israel, both in bombing the Osirak reactor in 81 and also bombing Assad's clandestine nuclear program in 2007. You had a 3rd case of a rogue regime that was developing nuclear weapons, actually much more advanced than people knew, and that was the case of Libya. Now, that was stopped in 2003 after the invasion of Iraq. Libya saw what happened to Saddam and decided to come clean of its nuclear program and to remove everything. You have the other example, the 4th regime is North Korea, where there were diplomatic agreements that were signed by North Korea. There were successive American presidents, both President Clinton in the 1990s and George W. Bush in the early 2000s, that hailed these agreements as being critical to keeping a peaceful region. And then you saw what happened. Without a credible military threat against North Korea, they developed nuclear weapons. And now they threaten a huge chunk of Asia, and they're building missiles with greater and greater, longer and longer range that soon can hit, I mean, they hit well past Japan, but can ultimately hit the United States, and they're threatening the world. Now, Iran's regime can be more dangerous than 50 North Koreas. And I think the route of diplomacy is not going to get us where we want to go without a credible military threat. It begins with a credible military threat so that the leaders of Iran know that if they cross certain red lines, that there would be military action against them. Whether it's the United States would be the best because of the power they have, and certainly Israel. And the Prime Minister has made it clear that Israel is going to do whatever it has to do to defend itself. I want you to understand, Pooria, the Iranian regime openly calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. We are the only country in the world that is threatened by another regime with annihilation.
That was my next question. Will Israel act independently if it's needed, without US's approval?
Absolutely. Israel acted independently before. When we bombed Osirak in 1981, the Reagan administration wasn't aware of it before, and when they found out about it, I think they condemned Israel in the Security Council, and they stopped weapons transfers for 3 months. But Menachem Begin, the prime minister at the time, understood that this could be a danger to the very survival of the state of Israel. And when it comes to matters of our fundamental vital interests, Israel will act without the support of the United States. It's happened time after time. Israel, when it declared its independence, was effectively threatened by the American State Department at the time to not do it. And David Ben Gurion, the prime minister at the time, made the decision to do it. In 1967, Israel went to the Johnson administration when a noose was being put around our neck then. And the Johnson administration told Israel, if you act alone, you'll be alone. But we acted alone because we had no choice to preempt that danger. The same thing happened, as I said, in 1981 when Menachem Begin made that decision. In 2007, when it came to Syria, they knew about it. The American administration knew about it, but they didn't act. And Israel, in that time, was Prime Minister Omar, took that action. This is the number one issue that the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, sees before him. It's the issue that drives him more than any other because it is the one existential threat to the state of Israel. So if Iran believes that Israel will somehow, its hands will be tied by this or that U.S. administration, they're kidding themselves. We'll put ourselves, we have to always be in a position to take action. We don't want to, we don't seek it, we don't seek war, but we cannot allow such a regime to develop nuclear weapons.
Speaking of this capability, it means that Israel has a credible military plan.
When a prime minister of Israel threatens another country with a credible military threat, they should take him very, very seriously.
We talked about Iranian people, and you rightly mentioned that should be the core of every country's foreign policy towards Iran, supporting Iranian people. How Israel is implementing this policy? Many people, especially in Iran, believe Israel's concern is only the nuclear issue. As soon as it is resolved, Israel will give up on Iranian people and their support. What is Israel's policy towards Iran?
Well, I think my own personal policy is that we should support the Iranian people as much as possible, because I think this is the one thing that avoids, I think, two very bad outcomes. One outcome is a nuclear-armed Iran, which is a catastrophe for the entire world and certainly for the people of Iran, for all our neighbors. And the other outcome is potential military action, which you have to say, which I also think is bad. It's better than the catastrophic outcome of getting a nuclear-armed Iran. If that's the only choice, then it's clear what we're going to have to do. But I think the best outcome is to support the people of Iran. And there are many things that you could do to support them.
How is Israel supporting Iranian people right now?
Well, I think one thing we can do is what I'm doing right now, is to speak as a minister in Israel's government and to reach out to the people of Iran. That's why I'm doing this interview. That's why the Prime Minister of Israel gave an interview. And I think whatever we can do to show them that the outside world supports them. And when the Prime Minister goes to meetings with world leaders and he tells them, support the people of Iran. When he speaks at the United Nations, he says, support the people of Iran. We don't have a fight, as I said, we don't have a fight with the people of Iran. The people of Iran are partners in this against the common enemy. So we have to think about actions that we can take, whether it's just communicating a message of solidarity, helping whatever we can do with communications to make sure that they can communicate with one another, different things that we can do to help the people of Iran, and also to convince the world that it's possible. I think one of the things that Natan Sharansky taught me, who was a dissident behind the Iron Curtain, is people see these regimes, in this case it was the Soviet Union, and they see that they're so fearsome, and they think they're so strong, but actually they're very, very weak because they're rotten from the inside. It's like a tree that is completely rotted out, and you touch the bark and the whole thing crumbles. And there's no question in my mind that the people of Iran, you saw them rise up last year. Next, I don't know if it's going to be in a month or 2 months or 3 months or 6 months. It's going to happen. There's going to be a spark. And at that point, the whole thing could change because these fear societies are run on fear. And eventually the level of fear drops. And when the level of fear drops even a little bit, then you see the number of people who are protesting spread from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands and then millions. And then they lose control. And what you're seeing happening now in Iran is very much like what you saw happening. A lot of people who are experts at Iran say it very much looks like the way the Soviet Union looked like at the end of its reign. And you can see the possibility of all of this crumbling because people will no longer believe in this regime. And the courage that they show, it's becoming clearer and clearer. The number of people who went out in the protests last September were greater than had gone out in the wake of the elections. And they sustained it week after week after week. And people in Israel, I tell people in my country, Israel, when we have protests going around, I say, this is not bravery. I mean, it's part of democracy where you protest the government, you disagree with this or that policy. You have protests in France, you have protests in the United States, you have protests in Israel. In Iran, it's courage because people, they're risking their lives. They're risking long imprisonment. They're risking the torture of their families. They're risking the rape of their daughters because it's an evil regime. And I don't think people fully understand it. Frankly, I think the international community spoke more about the protests that happened in a democratic Israel than they spoke out against the protests that were happening in a dictatorship called Iran. I think that's where everybody's focus should be. And my guess is if the Iranian people know that they have the complete commitment of the outside world to their cause, if the outside world says, we're not going to do business with this regime, we're not doing deals with this regime. We're going to put a credible military threat and we're going to make sure that they know they're not going to race to the bomb. We're going to put crippling sanctions and prevent them from selling oil. And we are going to back the people of Iran. Now, if they know that that policy is solid and stands on those three strong legs, I believe you're going to see more people cross that line between being a dissident and also moving away from doublethink. You know what doublethink is? It's people in Iran who hate the regime, but they're afraid. And they're not willing to say what the dissidents are willing to say. I think you're going to see a lot of people cross over the line to dissent, and it will grow from thousands and tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands and millions. And that's when we can peacefully resolve this issue. And I can tell you, it may not be true of other countries in the region, but I don't fear a strong Iran at all. But others may, because of historic battles that they've had. Maybe some of our Arab neighbors don't want to see a very, very strong Iran. I don't know. But we don't have a problem with a strong Iran. I just want a free Iran, because a free Iran is not going to be a threat to its own people, and it's not going to be a threat to us. And we know we have a history. Israel and the Jewish people go back thousands of years with the people of Persia. And we've had great examples of cooperation and partnership. Cyrus is the most powerful example, where he's written into our Bible as well, allowing the Jews to go rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, speaking of which all the denial of the right of the Jews to their home. If there's a leader who understands the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, it was actually the Persian leader, Cyrus.
Yeah, there have been roughly 40 weeks of protests against your government in Israel. Will this affect Netanyahu's foreign policy? These domestic
No,
issues?
I don't think so. Let's also remember that in our protests, nobody's risking their lives. Nobody gets killed. They go out and they protest this or that policy of the government. As I said, when people talk about protests and compare it, I'm saying you have to understand what it is to risk your life in a fierce society and the amount of courage that takes. The Prime Minister, I understand, the Prime Minister has never lost his focus. In the over 2 decades I've been with him, the one North Star has been the Iranian regime. I think what's new, and this I can tell you, Pوریا, what's new is a growing recognition of how dangerous the Iranian regime is to its own people, because they tried to hide it for a long time. And it was a brief period in 2009 where it sort of popped out. But because of what happened with Mahsa Amini, that started changing public opinion in a lot of places. You could see it in Europe, yes. I saw, and also because of the provision of drones that have been used to kill Ukrainians. I think that has opened a lot of minds in Europe. And I think the Iranian people have more support there than they did, more people who are willing to listen to them. And certainly in America, this is something that I think the Iranian people should not lose hope and should not lose faith that they're going to mobilize the world to their side. They are definitely...
Probably the same type of support we are getting from civil society in the West and the media we need to get from their politicians too.
Absolutely. But that eventually what happens in democracies, if you win public opinion, you're going to win the politicians.
Is Israel trying in this direction with the international community?
There's no question. When I go to meetings with officials, I speak about the Iranian people all the time. Okay. And I say they're your partners. Focus on them. That the regime is inherently weak. It looks very dangerous, but in 1 second it could go down. And it could go down with the support of the people of Iran. And it could go down without firing a shot. If the Iranian people has enough support and enough courage and enough support from the outside world and enough courage from within, I think it's possible to change history and to change the whole region for the better.
Ambassador, a few months back, let's move on to the next topic, and then I have a couple of other questions about the Iranian people at the end of this interview as well. A few months back, Iran and Saudi Arabia made a peace deal brokered by China. Were you surprised when the deal was announced?
Well, I wasn't surprised. I think the Chinese wanted to sort of step in where they saw America pulling away. But I think the Saudis are under no illusions about the Iranian regime. I think for Saudi Arabia, it was more about Yemen.
Do you think Saudis see Iran now as a regional partner and ally?
No. And what's important for me is, when I ask myself the question is, does Saudi Arabia understand that Iran is still a danger to it? And
do they understand?
Totally. 100% they understand that. I think the calculation of Saudi Arabia, a lot had to do with Yemen and trying to maintain the ceasefire, maybe extricating themselves from this very long war in Yemen so that the leadership of Saudi Arabia could focus on Vision 2030, on economic development, on this economic corridor that was announced at the G20 recently that will link Asia to Europe.
From India to Europe.
Exactly. Those are the things that they want to focus on. And if they can de-escalate the situation with Iran,
they welcome it.
Yeah, they will welcome it, but I think they understand that their partner in the region, partners, one of them is Israel. And I think they understand that Iran is not somebody that can be relied on.
We get to the
Yeah.
Israel-Saudi deal. How do you see China's role in this peace deal? Generally, China's role, because many people in Iran, many people who are watching this interview tonight, think the regime is in power. One of the main reasons this regime is still in power is because of China and Russia's support. How do you see these two countries' roles? I know Israel has close relationship with two countries, but what can you say?
We have good relationships with both Russia and China. They're not enemies.
Mhm.
We don't want to turn countries into enemies. There's no question that China, last numbers that I saw, buys about 90% of Iranian oil. So there's no question that that's economically propping up the regime. And they probably think they can buy it more cheaply because it's sanctioned. That China has huge resources needs, huge oil needs. And so they turn to Iran for that. But I think it's important to understand for the Chinese that.
So what do you say to Chinese officials when you meet with them?
I think their interests will not be served by having such a dangerous and reckless regime in Iran. I mean, I'm not.
Do they realize that?
I don't know. You'd have to interview a Chinese minister, but I believe the Chinese will follow their own interests, and I think their long-term interests would be to not have such a dangerous, reckless regime in the heart of a region where 20% of the world's oil pass through those Straits of Hormuz. Such a dangerous regime that is trying to attack ships and threatens international waterways. I don't think that's good for China.
The situation is a bit different with Russia. Iran, Islamic Republic, is clearly supporting Russia in their fight with Ukrainians, giving them drones and other logistics. How do you see Vladimir Putin's role in keeping Iran with what it is right now?
Well, they obviously have a partnership with Iran is supplying them with a lot of drones and helping them in the war with Ukraine. For us, we have reached a sort of modus operandi in Syria, where we are acting in Syria against Iranian positions there. And we try to avoid having clashes with Russia in Syria. And we've been pretty successful over the last decade, more or less, of trying to avoid that type of conflict. So we're facing a situation that other countries are not facing in terms of Russia and the sensitivities there. Our concern is that as Iran provides more and more to Russia, Russia will provide more and more to Iran. And
Which they are.
And how can that affect our interests? And so we look at that very, very carefully all the time to make sure that the Russians are not providing the Iranian regime with things that could threaten us. But it's a very difficult line to walk.
Is there any talks, collaboration between Russia and Israel about this issue?
We speak to them about our concerns all the time, and they make clear that they're not providing certain things to Iran. But, as these streets tend to not stay one way the whole time. Remember, Iran at the beginning was saying they weren't providing drones to Russia. You remember that?
Yeah,
it wasn't that long ago, right? Yeah. Speaking about how truthful the regime is. Now they're manufacturing hordes of these drones. So the Russians have said that they're not providing certain things to the Iranians.
So Russians are aware of this.
Well, yes, they're aware of it. And, they say they're not going to provide them A, B, C, and D. But, time will tell. And there's a concern that we have. And we keep our eye on that very, very closely.
Ambassador, let's get to Israel-Saudi talks, which you are very much involved, as media say. Both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, clarified in their interviews with Fox News that it is going in the right direction.
Right.
Are we close to a peace deal with Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think what they both said was we're getting closer every day. Yeah, there are a lot of moving parts to it. There's a lot of requests that the Saudi government has of the United States. There's a lot of issues that are on the table. So it's very, very complicated, and it's a three-way deal. Sometimes they say in the Middle East, it doesn't take two to tango, it takes three to tango. So we're trying to see if we can square the circle on all these issues.
So I'm optimistic. You mean the United States, yeah?
Yeah, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. I'm optimistic that it's possible to achieve this breakthrough, which, as the Prime Minister Yeah, I think we have a window of opportunity over the next several months. I personally believe that ultimately we're going to get a deal a normalization or peace agreement, if you will, between Israel and Saudi Arabia, because I think the interest, both the economic and the security interest of Saudi Arabia, is to move into an alliance, into a partnership with Israel. So I think we'll ultimately get it. I think it's going to happen in the next few months. I think that's the time period. And I think if there's a peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia, I think it effectively means the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I think it's a game changer in terms of the relationship between the Muslim world and the one and only Jewish state.
Exactly. Is Iran part of these talks with Saudis?
No. I think the Iranians will do everything they can in order to undermine those talks. They will consider it a blow to them.
No, I mean Iran issue. Is Iran issue part of these talks you have with Saudis?
No, I don't. I wouldn't put
the peace deal they made with the Iranian regime.
No, it's not.
Ambassador, couple of last questions. A year ago these days, Iranians, they were in the streets chanting death to the dictator, demanding regime change, clearly. What do you think of these three words? Woman, life, freedom.
I'm for all of them. I'm for all of them. I think it's wonderful. I think that's, France had its call for freedom and America had its call for freedom in its history. That's the call of the Iranian people for freedom. And I have no doubt that when this regime goes into the dustbin of history, that those three words will be emblazoned on the side of some of your public buildings as a call for future generations to understand that there was once this tyranny that held the Iranian people hostage, and they freed themselves from this tyranny, and they proceeded to enjoy a glorious future.
This is your camera, Ambassador. What is your message to the Iranian regime officials, who I'm sure they are watching this interview?
Well, to the Iranian regime officials, I will say Israel's not going to go gently into that good night. There have been many civilizations that have tried to destroy the Jewish people. I was ambassador in Washington, and almost every country around the world has ambassadors in Washington. But I never met the ambassador of ancient Babylon. I never met the ambassador of Imperial Rome. I never met the ambassador of the Thousand-Year Reich. So all of those states that claimed that they were going to destroy the Jews and they were going to destroy the Jewish state, they're gone from history. And those who are the friends of the Jews, they had a glorious future. So I would just tell them, beware of threatening Israel with annihilation. Beware of making that promise, because those who promise it to destroy the Jewish people or the Jewish state, they themselves were destroyed.
And from the same camera, what is your message to the Iranian people?
Keep strong. Don't lose faith. Eventually you will triumph, you will win, and you will, I think, restore the great civilization that Iran was. And you are our key partners for the future. Israel, the people of Israel stand with you. And I think the more you chant, the more you stand, the more you're going to get leaders and peoples around the world to stand with you. And eventually you will win.
Ambassador Ron Dremer, thank you for your time.
Thank you.